I rescued this wood from a burn pile to create these really cool flag decorations and these beautiful coasters, all inspired by my favorite food group, sliced bread. You'll want to watch this entire video because I learned a lot of lessons along the way that will save you time, reduce frustration, and improve the quality in your own work if you decide to build this yourself. Plus, I have one bonus trick that you've probably seen in other YouTube videos that didn't help at all and actually caused some problems, and I'm sure you don't want to miss out on that one. Now, before I actually pick out the scraps of wood I want to use on this project, I want to make sure that my flag, well, it looks like a flag. So I went online and actually found a flag calculator that made it easy to figure out what size and dimension each part of the flag needed to be. I'll leave a link for this free calculator down below, along with some links to other items I used in this project to take the guesswork out of everything if you make this project on your own. For the flag design, I decided to use some walnut and red oak because it will give me some light and dark colors for the stripes that I need to make the flag design. Plus, I had some scraps large enough to make the size flag that I wanted. And as you will see here shortly, I didn't consider the final size of this thing when I started planning out this project, which really caused me some headaches down the road. Apparently, there are some things in life where size does matter, and this is one of them. Now, I did get lucky and I was able to solve for this, and I'll show you that solution in just a few minutes. But the first thing you need to do is consider the tools that you have in your shop before you determine the final size of your project. Here you see me milling down some boards that will make the stripes in the flag. These boards have been jointed and flattened on two sides from previous projects, so all I need to do is send them through the planer and get them all down to the same thickness for my stripes. With that done, I can rip these pieces down to the thickness that I need to create the stripes in the flag. 7 of these pieces, 4 walnut and 3 red oak, will be a little wider and will make the long stripes of the flag. The other 6 pieces, 3 each of walnut and red oak, will be a little narrower. This accounts for the portion of the stripes on the flag that are next to the stars. We will make the portion for the star piece of the flag later on in the project, after we get the first few set of stripes glued up into blocks. Speaking of gluing things up, this is the point in the project where I tried a tip and trick that I've seen in other YouTube videos, and it actually didn't work out too well for me. Now, I've seen makers in the past sprinkle a little bit of salt in their glue when they're gluing up boards. The idea is that the salt will create a little bit of friction and keep the boards from sliding around once you apply clamping pressure. And technically this did work for me. It kept the boards from sliding around when I clamped them together, but for some reason, whether these boards were too small, or the table salt I was using was too coarse, or the clamping pressure I applied wasn't enough, maybe I didn't use enough glue, I don't know. But doing this actually caused some of the seams in my glue up to not come out quite as seamless as I would have hoped in my final project. Plus, I ended up cutting the edges of these boards flush after they were glued up anyway, so this was really unnecessary and a step I should have skipped. And you should too. Let me know your experience with this technique, good or bad, in the comments down below. And go ahead and subscribe if you want me to help you avoid mistakes in the future. I ended up gluing 6 of the larger stripes of the flag into one block and all 6 short stripes of the flag into another one. And boom! With the magic of YouTube, the glue is cured. With the glue cured and everything out of the clamps, I used some not recommended and questionable sanding techniques to get the side of the short stripes perfectly flat before considering how to move forward with the star portion of the flag. And while you weren't watching, I went ahead and glued up some white oak and walnut just to show you another example of how this process could be used and something that is a little bit more simple than our flag project that we have going on back here. See here, we have this giant hole where the stars would typically go. We need to fill this with some more walnut. You can also see how this long walnut stripe will go on the very top to cap this wood loaf bread thing. Now that I know how big of a block I need to make the star portion of the flag, I just glued up some more scrap walnut and milled it down to a size that would fit inside that missing space. And this is where you want to glue the star portion and the short stripe block part of the flag together before moving on. And this is the first tip that I would highly recommend. This allows us to get the entire chunk perfectly flat on both sides before doing the final glue up where everything will be sandwiched together like a loaf of bread. First of all, speaking of sandwiches, I'm starting to get hungry. And second, this video was sponsored by Sliced Bread. Has anyone really made anything better since this stuff was created? With the sponsorship out of the way, I do have a few more tips up my sleeve. Well, maybe not up my sleeve, but I do have some things that I want to share with you before we get to the part of the video where I realized size was going to be an issue. With the short stripes and stars glued together and cleaned up with a little bit of sanding, I could finally move on to gluing together all the layers of this flag loaf. I simply glued the long stripe block to the stars and stripe block, then capped off the entire thing with one last long walnut stripe piece to make the final flag design. And once the glue dried, I could finally take this over to my miter saw and clean up the edges a little bit before moving on with the project. And this is the point where I realized I had a serious problem. The wood block was too thick for my miter saw to cut all the way through. Now at this point, I decided I would just sand down the part that my miter saw couldn't cut through with the belt sander and just move on with the project to tip number 2. Do all of your finish sanding on all 6 sides of the block before you cut this thing up into little bitty slices. Sanding now is way easier and will save you a ton of time over waiting to do this after you have everything sliced up into bread-like pieces, especially if you're making coasters with thinner edges. I like to use this 3M extract paper when I sand, and I sanded everything down to 180 grit before moving on to tip number 3. Use a 1/8 inch roundover bit on all the outside corners of each block. This will be way easier than trying to round over each piece once it's sliced up, if this is the look you're going for, which I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't want to do this. Anyway, with the final outside corners rounded over, I could finally move on to completing the final sanding with 220 grit. We can almost move on to slicing these things into pieces. But what if I told you I have one more tip to give you before slicing these things up? Would you even believe me? Well, you should, because here you can see me taping the entire outside edge of all of these blocks. This is going to greatly reduce any tear out that could happen when we start slicing these things down into thinner pieces. The coasters were pretty easy to slice up. I set a stop block on my miter saw to 3/8 of an inch and started hacking away at this block of wood like it was a loaf of bread. I ended up getting about 12 coasters out of this block of wood before I started to fear for the safety of my fingers. The problem I needed to work out was with this flag block. I already knew it was too thick for my miter saw to cut all the way through. You can see my blade cannot get deep enough, and I'm about a 1/2 inch short. Now I understand how bad it sucks when you're just a little bit short, but I do have a solution that can help you on this project, of course. Go ahead and cut the slice as deep as you can on your miter saw. By the way, I cut these to about 1 1/8 inch thick. Then just go to your table saw and line up your cut with the table saw blade and finish the cut on the table saw. Now this wasn't actually perfect because the blade on my miter saw and the blade on my table saw were not exactly the same thickness, but in the end, with a little bit of sanding, I was able to get some beautiful slices out of this block, and no one will ever know about this little problem I had. Speaking of sanding, I used some double-sided sticky tape to attach some scrap wood to my workbench so that it would hold the flag pieces in place while I sanded the cut edges. This worked out pretty good, and this is a tip I'm just giving away for free because I'm sure anyone out there with a silicone sanding mat will think this is just silly. And since I don't care what those people think, and I wanted to see the grain pop on this wood, I decided to move on to the finishing process. For this, I'm using Black Forest Monocoat furniture oil. This finish is very similar to Rubio Monocoat Clear, but unlike Rubio Monocoat, this is a one-part system that you don't need to mix together with a hardener, meaning it gets hard on its own. And it's a little cheaper, which means I might be able to afford a silicone sanding mat one day. Plus, this stuff smells really good too. And just a disclaimer, I don't promote the huffing of any finishing products on this channel. Either way, just apply a very small amount of this oil with a piece of white buffing pad. Really use some pressure to buff it into the wood fibers, then just let it sit for a few minutes before wiping off the excess with a few clean shop towels. It will be smooth and dry to the touch right away when applied appropriately. And just like that, you have a beautiful, easy to make scrap wood project that you can use to brag to your friends, your family, or sell for a hefty profit. And the other great thing about this project is that the options are limitless. You can combine different materials and create custom one-of-a-kind designs that will set your work apart from others. I hope you share the designs you make with me on my Ben Van Kirk Makes It Instagram account, but before you do, click on the video that just popped up on your screen for another amazing scrap wood project and build it yourself. Thanks for watching.